First mistake that Randy and I identified as really the most common mistake that crankbait fishermen make is that most anglers don't actually let their crankbait get down to the bottom or interact with some sort of object. This is a super common mistake that a lot of new crankbait fishermen make because they're really just scared of getting their crankbait hung up. If we take a look at a crankbait over here, I'm just going to pull up a couple examples of crankbaits. You'll see that your crankbaits have all these treble hooks on them. Well, you can't see the treble hooks here, but you'll have some treble hooks on these baits, and they're going to get hung up very often if you are trying to reel them through thick cover, brush pile, stuff like that, if you don't know what you're doing with the crankbaits. But there are a lot of ways you can actually work the crankbait in terms of your retrieve and your casting angle to avoid hangups while still interacting with cover. And so what we want to kind of talk about first is how to actually pick the right crankbait to hit the bottom of the lake, but also avoid getting hung up. And I'm just going to start with my top 4 suggestions for crankbaits, and then Randy will get into it here as well. Really, my crankbait selection is pretty straightforward. I have a few more that I throw that I'm going to talk about here, but I just want to give you guys 4 really good options to start out with when you're fishing a crankbait. My number 1 option, especially when I'm fishing deeper than 12 feet of water, is the Strike King 6XD crankbait. This bait dives anywhere from 12 to 20 feet of water depending on your line size, and it has a really long bill on it, which allows it to deflect off cover really well. You can crank it straight through brush piles, standing timber, rocks, and you're not going to get hung up as long as you keep reeling that bait at a good speed. If you stop reeling a lot of times, that'll cause the bill of the bait to rise up and your hooks will get hung up in the cover. So as long as you continually reel that bait at a steady pace, the bill will actually deflect off cover and keep you out of trouble. Again, this bait is great when you're fishing in 12 to 20 feet of water offshore. The next bait that I throw a lot is the Spro Mike McClone Rock Crawler 55. This is a little bit smaller bait that dives anywhere from 9 to 14 feet of water. And it also has a pretty long bill which deflects cover. And I throw this bait whenever I'm fishing anywhere from 6 to about 12 feet of water. The bait dives 9 to 14 feet, but I'll throw it as shallow as 5 or 6 feet of water because that longer bill will deflect off cover and you won't have to worry about getting hung up at all. So you can grind that thing into rocks and into stumps and the bill will deflect it even in shallower water. And that's one tip I can give to you guys right now. When you're picking a crankbait, pick a crankbait that runs 2 to 3 feet deeper than the depth you're trying to fish. So if you're trying to fish 8 feet of water, pick a bait that runs 10 to 12 feet deep. That will ensure you're making bottom contact and make sure it just has a nice good bill to deflect off the cover. The other bait I like to throw a lot when I get shallower water is the Megabass S-Crank Square Bill Crankbait. This is a square bill crankbait with a nice bill. Square bills are designed to deflect off a cover, and this bait comes through cover super well. Randy can talk about this bait a little bit more, and I'll kind of let you cover these, Randy. And this is a good shallow crankbait for when I'm fishing less than 6 feet of water. And then I also throw the Megabass Sonic Side flat or a square bill crankbait. It's a flat side crankbait, and whenever I'm fishing in colder water temperatures in less than 6 feet of water, this is the crankbait I go for. All these baits, though, have one thing in common. They have a bill that's designed to deflect off cover, which allows you to grind those baits into the bottom, off of rocks, off of stumps. And really, I don't get hung up on crankbaits that often at all, maybe only 2 or 3 times a day. And because a lot of times you're fishing shallow with these crankbaits, you can just go over there, knock the crankbait loose with your rod tip, and keep fishing. So that's kind of my suggestion on how to, one, avoid getting hung up with crankbaits, but also just some crankbaits to check out. Randy, what are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, crankbaits, there's so many different variables involved in choosing, the right crankbait, the right color, which we'll get into a little bit later. But one of the things that a lot of people need to realize on this crankbait fishing is that so much of the crankbait that you choose should be determined by, your water temperature, water clarity, the angle of the bank you're fishing, a lot of different variables. And I use so many different type of crankbaits just to match that particular situation. One of the things that you'll find about crankbait fishing is it's sort of a niche deal because crankbaits is one of those lure categories that probably has more like local niche type popularities than any other crankbait that you have. I mean, for example, here in the Ozarks, you have the rock crawler or the wiggle wart. You got the flat side homemade crankbaits in eastern Tennessee. You got the lipless crankbaits in the Southeast, Florida, Texas, all that type of stuff. So there's a lot of different areas where specific profiles and actions work better than the others. But ultimately, it's a combination of water clarity, the depth, the cover, the mood, and the personality of the fish that you're after that determines the selection on that. And, like I said, that we could write a book on that too, but what we're going to try to do today is just to sort of give you a foundation, give you some basic guidelines to give you something to start from.
For sure. Oh, there's an echo on your audio, Randy. I'm going to throw some headphones in here, and that way we don't have to worry about the echo anymore. I always forget about that. Just give me 1 second here, guys. Okay, now you shouldn't have the echo anymore. Randy, can you still hear me okay?
Yeah, you can hear me.
Gotcha.
But
okay.
One of the things, there's been crankbaits has been such an evolution, because I can remember back, when I very first started bass fishing back my dad used to take me down to Grand Lake and Table Rock Lake back in the 1960s. And that's back when the only crankbaits that there were was like the metal lip bombers, hellbenders, that type of stuff. There were no other crankbaits besides that. And then you evolved into the 1970s, when they came out with the Big O. That was the original crankbait that really got the bait onto, to the next level of popularity. And then you saw an explosion in the 80s and 90s. And now there's so many different styles and profiles and applications for crankbaits. You just can't even keep up with it. It's like overwhelming a little bit. So we're going to try to simplify things a little bit.
Yeah, and that's what I tried to do, guys, when I gave you that list of crankbaits just as a top level. Really, there are so many crankbaits. If we just go over to just like the crankbait page, so baits and the other crankbaits, you have shallow diving crankbaits, medium divers, deep divers, extra deep divers, oversized crankbaits, lipless crankbaits, so many options. And honestly, the actual crankbait itself, while it can make a big difference, the shape, the size, things like that, when you're just starting out crankbait fishing, I wouldn't get too caught up in all of those subtle differences, because really, on average, if you go to these shallow diving crankbaits, throwing a 13 fishing square bill crankbait versus a 6 cents versus a Balsa B versus a Strike King or whatever other crankbait you're throwing won't make a huge difference in the number of fish you catch. If you maybe throw like a Balsa crankbait versus a plastic crankbait, you might get 2 or 3 extra bites throughout the day, but it's not going to dramatically change your crankbait results. The most important things are the things we're going to talk about here in a minute, which are the other common mistakes anglers make. But really, the one thing I would recommend is just not getting too caught up in all of the different body styles, shapes, stuff like that. Just pick up a few crankbaits that you might hear in videos that anglers recommend in each season, like, for example, a flat side crankbait like the Sonic side when it's colder, or when it's warmer, like the Megabass S crank, which has a wider wobble, and then some of these deeper divers like we mentioned earlier, and go out and just fish. Now, one thing that I think really is going to help improve your offshore fishing game, which is, again, that your crankbait fishing game, is that first mistake of making sure you make bottom contact. And so if I share my screen here, one thing I want to show you guys is a PowerPoint that I have real quick. You guys know I love my graphics. And this is something that I see a lot of anglers do when they're crankbait fishing. They will cast their crankbait out, they will let it hit the water, and they'll just start reeling it. And they'll reel it at kind of a normal, steady pace, and it'll get down, let's say, 2/3 the way to the bottom. It will not hit any sort of objects, rock, cover, wood, anything like that, and then it will swim back up and come back to the boat. And you have missed the entire strike zone with that crankbait. What happens a lot of times is that strike zone where those fish are might only be 20 to 30 feet long. And it might be a rock pile, a brush pile, stumps, whatever it is, a lay down on the bank. And you need to have your bait interacting with the rocks, the cover, whatever is down there, bouncing off the cover for those bass to actually eat your bait. And what happens is that if your bait is not ever reaching that cover, you're never going to get bit. The other thing that can happen is that you might not be picking a deep enough crankbait to keep your bait in the strike zone long enough. For example, if you're throwing this rock crawler, maybe you're fishing in 12 feet of water, and this bait runs 12 feet deep. But maybe by the time that bait hits its maximum depth at 12 feet, it just barely enters the strike zone for a second or two and then is out of the strike zone. And you'll never get that fish to bite, or you have a very small opportunity to get that fish to bite. Versus if we switched out the rock crawler for a deeper diving crankbait, you might be able to get a bait that dives 16 to 18 feet deep, and you can start digging the bottom 10 feet before you reach that rock pile or that offshore area, grind that bait through the entire strike zone, and you'll have that bait in the strike zone for 5-10 seconds, which gives you a lot better opportunity to get bit. So the one thing I never can stress enough when crankbait fishing is pick a crankbait that runs 2 to 3 feet deeper than the spot you're trying to fish. If you're trying to fish a rock pile in 15 feet of water, pick a crankbait that dives 18 to 20 feet. If it's in 8 feet of water, pick a crankbait that dives 10 to 12 feet of water. Another thing that's really important is you want to make sure you don't position your boat in a way that's going to hinder how deep this crankbait dives. And that's actually the second big mistake. Before we move on from that, Randy, I just want to kind of give you the last word on this. Any other advice for the guys on trying to avoid getting that crankbait to run or to hit the bottom? Or to actually make it at the bottom?
Well, the important thing about that is it's sort of the same with jerkbait fishing, because in crankbait fishing or jerkbait fishing, you have a small window during your cast that you really have a high percentage of catching a quality bass. And like in crankbait fishing, if you're not bouncing that bait off of something or making contact with something, and say, for example, you get a bite on the way down, or if you get a bite on the way up, or if you happen to get a bite where the bait is not hitting the bottom, that's a rarity. And most of the time, those are going to be smaller fish. But those good fish, those quality 4-pound plus bass, are going to be coming when that bait is at its deepest point, or it's bouncing off something hard. It doesn't make any difference. So from an efficiency standpoint, that is the way that you have to, you got to, select the right tool for the job. That being said, I will say one thing. One of the things that I like to try to do in my crankbait fishing is I like to try to get certain crankbaits into areas that most people don't think are, applicable for that. And for an example, I like to throw real small crankbaits and try to get them deeper than what most people can get little crankbaits. I'm still wanting to hit the bottom with it. And sometimes I'll throw a big deep diving crankbait in 2 or 3 foot of water just to give the fish a different look. So there's a lot of different variables to that. That basically, just the one thing you need to remember as far as picking that right crankbait, the longer that you can keep that bait hitting the bottom in that strike zone, the better chance you got of catching a good one.
Yeah, and apparently I did not show you guys any of the graphics I was doing. Sorry guys, I've changed up some stuff here at the streaming software for this new channel, so that's what happened there. Let me show you guys that again. So to reset, when you're trying to ensure your bait is hitting the bottom, a lot of times what guys will do is they'll get that bait to hit the water, they'll reel it, and it'll get 2/3 of the way down to the strike zone. And let's say in this situation, I'll just kind of put a little text box. I'll do a better job even than I did before. Maybe your strike zone is like right here. This is where those fish are. And so if they're in that strike zone right there, and man, I'm going all out, Randy, with this graphic right now. You guys are getting a treat. Doing transparency, boom. Okay, there we go. So got the strike zone. If that strike zone is set up right there, then you need to make sure that your bait is landing in that strike zone, hitting into the strike zone and going through the rocks. The only way you're going to do that is to ensure your bait gets down to the bottom or to the object you're fishing before you actually make contact with it, maybe 10 to 12 feet, maybe 15 feet before you actually get to the strike zone, then work all the way through the strike zone and come out the other side. Again, if you're throwing a crankbait that only dives 12 feet deep in 12 feet of water, that bait might dive down, hit the kind of the top of the strike zone right in 12 foot for a second, and then come back out. So that bait's only in the strike zone for a second or two. And in that case, what you need to do is go to a deeper diving crankbait. And even if you're throwing a crankbait that dives 18 feet deep in 12 foot of water, that's not that big of a deal because the bills in these crankbaits are so big, they'll deflect off the cover and stuff like that. So you can start grinding that crankbait in the bottom maybe a third of the way through the cast, and even if you have it hit the bottom 20 feet before the strike zone, you're going to guarantee that it goes through the entire strike zone for the entire cast or the entire portion of the strike zone, and you give your you give the fish a chance to eat that bait a lot more. That bait's going to be in the strike zone for 5 to 10 seconds, and you're going to have a lot more success with your crankbaits. This applies for when you're fishing shallow water and offshore. It's not exclusive to offshore fishing. I'm just using this example right here. So hopefully that graphic explained what we were talking about earlier. So sorry about that, guys. Need to always remember the transition screens. There's so much going on. I got a PowerPoint here. I got the chat. I got Randy. Try and do the best we can, guys. But anyways, so that's it for the first mistake that a lot of crankbait fishermen make, not hitting the bottom or not hitting objects with their crankbaits.